Welcome to the Modern Athenas podcast with Sonia and Debbie, where we discuss how regular women became Athenas in their own time by working hard, persevering through the challenges in their lives, and contributing to a better world. This is podcast 18. In this podcast, we will be discussing the book, The Voice That Remembers, One Woman's Historic Fight to Free Tibet, by Ama Adhe. You can use the link on our website at modernathenas.com to order the book after the podcast. Before we begin, we would like to let our listeners know that some of the descriptions in this podcast are graphic and may not be appropriate for children. The Voice That Remembers is about Adhe, a Tibetan woman who was imprisoned by the Chinese and subjected to inhumane treatment in labor camps for over 20 years. Adhe's courage, perseverance, and strength throughout her imprisonment and her life embody the very essence of a modern Athena. Quote, "Although the circumstances of her life are tragic, the wisdom, strength, and courage that Ama Adhe sustained through those many torturous years place her among those rare human beings who would not turn their back on those in need or repeat a doctrine that they did not believe in. To Tibetans, Adhe is a symbol of courage and determination. To me, she speaks for a people who, against great odds, valiantly maintain their culture, their religion, and their inner freedom."
Adhe was born in 1932 into a Tibet that is very different from today. Many were nomads or farmers and moved up and down the mountains as the seasons changed. Adhe's family farm was 3 to 4 miles wide and 15 miles long in one of the most fertile valleys in all of Kham. In the summer months, the family traveled into the hills, living like nomads while they tended their land and allowed their animals and children to roam. Some of Adhe's favorite childhood memories are from the summer months, when she was free to run around the hills with her friends, basking in the sunshine, rolling around in the wildflowers, making small fires at night to cook dinner, and being free. During Adhe's childhood, the family took many pilgrimages to Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. There were large statues of Buddha, religious paintings hung on the walls, the air filled with the glow of butter lamps and incense. The monks and lamas would chant their prayers amid the sounds of horns, hand drums, cymbals, and the ceremonial conch. The family would turn the prayer wheels, spinning them in prayer, asking for blessings. The Dalai Lama is recognized by Tibetans as their leader. Quote, "My father told me of the great leader of Tibet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is the human manifestation of Chen Rezig, the perfect embodiment of unconditional compassion. During the first human incarnation in 1391, he vowed to protect and uplift the souls of all living beings, and he continues to reincarnate as the Dalai Lama to guide the Tibetan people. To see the Dalai Lama and to be worth of his guidance is the heart of every Tibetan's aspirations." End quote. So it seemed that the Tibetan family lived this really simple and self-sufficient life, and they had this partnership with the land and definitely a deep reverence for their faith.
Yeah, it definitely, I would say is life more simple than we know in modern times. And, part of the reason that we wanted to talk about this sort of visualization of what life is like in Tibet at that time is because of how much it's going to change. So again, these are people who live in the same area their entire lives. Their family is close to them. They have the monasteries that they visit, and they're getting guidance from the Dalai Lama. But as you were saying, Sonia, it's a very simple and yet very fulfilling life. Although there was always tension between Tibet and China, Tibet was independent and autonomous before 1949. Once the Chinese invaded and started occupying Tibet in 1949, they started a campaign to win the hearts and the minds of Tibetans. Quote, "The Communist Army held a public meeting in a large field. They announced, 'We are very glad to meet you. We have come to liberate you from the corruption of the Kuomintang regime, which is now forever finished. We have come to help you establish a true rule of the people, to better the living conditions of ordinary men, and to right past mistakes. We are guests in your region. We realize that these lands belong to you. After the completion of our duties, we will return to our native land. We are brothers and sisters, and we have only come to help you.' The communists continued to say, 'We are the same people. We have only come to help you and teach you to rule your own land. Then we will return to our land. At that time, even if you ask us to stay, we will not stay.' They said they had come to implement the policy of self-determination and self-rule." End quote. But those were not China's real intentions. Quote, "By that time, the Chinese had identified the most respected and influential Tibetans, the authorities of the society, the wealthy families, the beggars, the monks, and the abbots of the monasteries. Their main purpose in spending time with us had been to discern these things. They had effectively noted the wealth of the monasteries, how much livestock they possessed, and what types of statuary they contained. They had also collected information regarding the individual wealth of all the families in the region." End quote. In 1953, the Chinese selected leading individuals from families and monasteries and told them that they would be visiting China to see how glorious it was and how it was the envy of the world. Quote, "They were taken to several different towns during their factory tour. In one town, my father noticed that the Buddha statues and thangkas were being sold in the market. At one point during the tour, his part of the delegation became separated from the main group. Their translator was a former member of the Kuomintang who had recently, for the sake of self-preservation, converted to communism. My father became interested in an elderly Chinese man and, with the help of a translator, struck up a conversation with him. While they were talking, a truck full of Chinese Kuomintang prisoners drove by. 'You see there,' the old man told father, 'all of those prisoners will be executed. The communists are slowly plundering every family for their riches.' My father was horrified. A few moments later, a truck full of women prisoners arrived. All the women were pulled down from the truck and lined up to be shot. They were so terrified that many of them were falling down. Their shaking legs simply couldn't support them. Suddenly, my father felt he knew the communists' true intention, what their real policy was, behind all the seemingly noble speeches and promises. In his mind, all trust disappeared." End quote. Adhe's father died soon after his return from China. The Chinese began building highways into and around Tibet, but the Chinese weren't building the roads for the Tibetans. They were building roads so that they could more easily move their soldiers, equipment, and supplies into and around Tibet. 3 years after Adhe's father's trip to China, the Chinese began plundering the Tibetan monasteries and dispatched the monks and lamas to labor camps or to their deaths. In short order, Tibetan culture was destroyed. That same year, the first of the, quote, democratic reforms were introduced. Quote, "The main thrust of the democratic reforms was to nationalize all private property. The populace was informed that all personal land, herds, seeds, and agricultural implements would be collected and used for the betterment and modernization of the collective Tibetan society. Landowners were given receipts for the value of their property with promises of eventual payment, but they were never actually reimbursed. We soon realized that the long-term plans of the communists were to take everything that we possessed." End quote. The Chinese also instituted Damsing sessions, where the populace was forced to denounce each other, resulting in further divides amongst them. The resistance movement started to organize. Men went into the forest to plan their counterattack, and women stayed behind, acting as communication relays and providing supplies to the men. Adhe joined the resistance, but it was risky. If they were caught, they would be arrested and executed or sent to a labor camp. Adhe's husband passed away the same year, leaving her as a single mother of a son with a daughter on the way. So here we have the Chinese coming in and initially sort of pretending to win the hearts and the minds of the Tibetans. And then just as it seems like the Tibetans are starting to buy into what they're saying, they start this sort of forced implementation of communism, and they're starting to sort of round the dissidents up, and they're starting to force people into these sort of confines of and communes, and they're starting to destroy really Tibetan culture.
As this was unfolding, I was really thinking of that kind of cloak of darkness that we talked about when the Taliban arrived in Kabul with Kamala, and just the shock and horror of this completely different life that they were all going to be subject to. And it seemed like such a lose-lose situation where either they were to denounce their faith and their family or be executed and imprisoned. And what do you do in that situation? It just seems so hopeless.
In 1958, one of the men from the resistance group in the forest was caught by the Chinese and subjected to torture. Under torture, he gave Adhe's name as one of the people who was helping the resistance movement. In the early hours of the morning on October 16, 1958, 6 armed Chinese policemen and 3 Tibetans arrived at Adhe's house. She knew immediately that they had come to arrest her. Quote, "One of the Tibetans ordered, 'You must come with us now.' I told them that it wasn't possible because I could not leave my children. At that point, first one man, then several more, came forward and started beating me. They kicked and hit me, and I was struck very hard on my right ear. I fell on the floor and was tied with rope. As they tied me, my little daughter, now awake, laughed happily as she sat on the bed. She must have thought that we were playing a game. My son kept crying, screaming, and calling, 'Ama, Ama.' He kept trying to reach me to grasp my dress, but the soldiers kept pushing him back, kicking him hard with their boots. I still refused to walk, insisting that I couldn't leave my children, so they dragged me outside. Everyone had gathered outside their tents, and they begged them not to take me, but it was useless. Pulling the ropes, they dragged me along the ground a distance of about 1 kilometer to the monastery." End quote. When they reached the monastery, the policemen were angry with Adhe for refusing to cooperate. They asked her if she had known what she had done and whether now she would realize that they had won. Quote, "Now we will see how brave and strong you really are." End quote. While being interrogated and tortured at the monastery, Adhe decided she would not break, but she would also not plead for mercy. She was soon transferred to the prison. Quote, "The first thing that they did at the prison was take away my chumba belt, bootstraps, the silk cords that tied my hair, my rosary, and my amulets. This, of course, was to prevent suicide. Then I was taken downstairs and put into a cell for women prisoners. Inside were 4 women who stared at each other, afraid to speak. Conversation was not allowed. The female guard showed me one spot where I was supposed to stay. There was no type of bedding and no mattresses. A wooden bucket in the center of the room served as the only toilet. There was no water available inside the cell, which was about 9 by 15 feet. It had no electricity or any form of lighting except for a small hole through which the guards looked. Every morning at 10 and in the evening at 5, someone would be allowed out to empty the toilet pot. The food given to the prisoners was quite poor and meager. There was no form of cleaning whatsoever." End quote. So very early on, when she's taken away by the police, you see this bravery and courage and sort of this resolve that she has.
Adhe underwent interrogation when she arrived at the prison. Quote, "While being interrogated, I was handcuffed, kicked, and struck with rifle butts all over my body. They forced me to kneel on 2 sharpened triangular pieces of wood with my hands raised above my head. Every time I lowered my arms, they struck my elbows with rifle butts. Somehow, though, I managed not to tell them anything. I was given 3 days in my cell to decide whether I wanted to go back to my children and my mother by informing on all the members in the group, or whether I was prepared to die for the sake of not cooperating. After suffering tremendously and undergoing so many atrocities, I couldn't bear the thought of inflicting this on my friends. Every night I reaffirmed my resolve to be silent, no matter what." End quote. The interrogation stopped. One morning, not long after, Adhe and another woman were called out of their cell and taken upstairs. Quote, "They took off my handcuffs, which were difficult to remove because they had begun to be wedged deeply into the skin." End quote. Her hands were then tied back with rope. They were driven down to the plain where an army headquarters had been built. When they arrived, a huge crowd had gathered. A sign was placed around her neck. They were made to stand. The Chinese also brought out a man who Adhe knew well, Pema Gyaltsen. He too had been imprisoned. A rope was wound around his neck and then tied on his arms, pulling the rope back. He smiled at Adhe, barely able to breathe. He knew he was going to die. Over the loudspeaker, the Chinese announced that he was going to be executed and that Adhe was sentenced to 16 years of reform through labor. Adhe heard 2 gunshots, and he fell over, dead right in front of her. Quote, "I asked the Chinese to kill me also, but they said, no, if we kill you, it's like Pema Gyaltsen dying in front of your eyes. It will be over too quickly. We want you to suffer for the rest of your life. Now you see who has won." End quote. It's so incredible in the midst of these things that she's starting to see that she has this resolve, and she's not breaking, and she's not afraid of death. She actually asks for it.
Yeah, and I just wondered, as I was reading this, I thought, where does she get this resolve from? I mean, it obviously was deeply rooted in her, whether it was her parents or another family member, or just, what she was taught through her childhood. Maybe it was, her faith, her religion, but you continue to see it throughout the book. I mean, it's just this absolute steadfast, forward moving, just resolve. Adhe ended up being imprisoned for over 20 years. Adhe was moved between different prisons and labor camps, suffering through forced labor at each camp. Quote, "Every morning the prisoners were awakened at 7. At 8 we were given a cup of watery gruel, and at night we were gathered together in the courtyard and then escorted by guards to work in lines of 2. We generally worked for 4 hours and then were given something to eat. After lunch, most of the prison guards rested for an hour, and then the prisoners worked for another 4 hours." End quote. They were then marched back to their cells, sometimes given something else to eat, and locked in for the night. Quote, "We sat and listened in the cell to the sounds going by outside and wondered what was happening. When one is imprisoned, the smallest sound takes on a magnitude of importance. The sound of approaching feet can mean that someone is about to be tormented, or it can mean that the terrible monotony of the day will be broken by some type of meal. The sound of a bird means that it's light outside. The sound of a voice can mean a scrap of news. The sound of trucks can mean that a major change is about to happen." End quote. So you have just these absolute horrific conditions in these so-called labor camps, and there's Adhe again, just grinding through it with this resolve.
Well, and it's almost like she's trying to find that center of what she can even focus on and grasp. And, it's incredible how she describes these different sounds, and it just seems almost like a hypersensitive existence at this point. In these camps where there's just not a whole lot going on, and it's completely hopeless.
Yeah, and her faith that she had in these darkest hours to continue living and surviving. It's very admirable. Life in the camps was unbearable, and often Adhe just wanted to end her life to make the torment end. She found solace in reciting Tibetan prayers at night to herself in her cell, trying to take herself away from the misery. She never gave in to the Chinese, never professed that she was now reformed. Her resistance was noted in her prison record, and each time she was transferred to a new camp, she was labeled as a troublemaker and harassed and tortured in different ways. She was also repeatedly threatened with execution. Every night, they had 2-hour meetings that were designed to, quote, re-educate the women. Quote, basically, the purpose of those meetings was to make the prisoners believe that in every respect, politically, economically, militarily, China under the Communist Party had no equal in the world. The impression was given that no other country could compete with the Chinese. These were the basic points of indoctrination. I was always determined to record in my mind as clearly as possible everything I witnessed of the sufferings of the Tibetans under the Chinese. In the light of many, often unbearable memories, the only possible recourse for me was to go completely against the Chinese, so there was no way that I could participate in the propaganda the prisoners were made to repeat. In meetings, we were expected to express enthusiasm as we listened on discourses on the meaning of Mao's words about our lives and the future of Tibet. Of course, after the long day's work, our greatest effort was to appear awake and alert and ignore the stiffness in our muscles and joints, lest shifting our bodies too frequently be taken as disrespect for the evening's message. End quote. Another woman told Adhe, quote, no matter what the officials do outwardly, unless you allow it, they can never enter your heart. End quote. And these re-education meetings in Tibet are very similar to the types of re-education meetings that are still going on in North Korea. It's this sort of forced ingestion of the propaganda of the regime.
Well, and I imagine there was some temptation to just kind of give in, and, who wouldn't be tempted to just take the easier path? But she stood by and never, ever, ever gave in to the propaganda. And, she forced them to batter her body because they couldn't get to her heart and mind.
Adhe was kind and generous to the other prisoners. Quote, we tried to assist each other in whatever small ways we could as we waited in the darkness for a day when something out of the ordinary would happen. End quote. They were not allowed to talk with each other, so they learned when and how to avoid detection by the guards and pass news and information to each other. But they had to be careful. Prisoners were rewarded for informing on one another, and you never knew who an informant was. Adhe was frequently a victim of these informants as they tried to tear her down and use her as a shield to protect themselves. Quote, I always remember how I swore to my friends, one day, when the time comes, I will speak of everything that we've gone through under the Chinese. When we get out, I promise that somehow I will make these things known. End quote. And, I was wondering, in these moments, just these very brief moments that the women have to pass information or talk to each other, they also then have this other layer of not knowing whether or not that one person that they're talking to is going to inform on them and make their torture even worse. So in the face of that, I don't know. Maybe I would just be silent and say nothing, but here's Adhe, brave and courageous, and she continues to interact with these women.
Yeah, it didn't stop her from, standing her ground in the only way that she could, which was to guard her heart and mind. And in a way, all they had left was how they responded to this evil and this betrayal as individuals. And that must have been an incredibly lonely place to be. In the winter of 1974, Adhe had served 12 years of prison. Quote, In winter 1974, I was returned to the main section of the women's labor camp. One day, the Chinese head of the camp called me to her office and started scolding me, saying, "So now you have finished your sentence, but unlike other prisoners, you won't be released because when we look at your records, we see that right from when you were arrested up to the women's labor camp, you have always opposed us. Because of that, you will still be kept under detention. Your attitude and behavior have been like throwing a stone on your own feet. All these years, you are the one who has suffered, not the Communist Party. Ultimately, it is you who are at a loss. From now on, if you are not careful, if you don't behave yourself, you will not have any rights. You will have no right to movement. Everybody will be looking at what Mrs. Adhe is doing, what Mrs. Adhe is saying." Normally, prisoners are free to return to society when their sentences are over, but the Chinese prison system usually finds reasons not to release them. In this way, as we are often told, the prisoners will never forget who their leaders are. Also, the communists find it very useful to production to make prisoners work for little or no pay in a system known as forced job placement, which is simply an extension of re-education through labor with no fixed term. There is absolutely no available means of appeal to the Public Security Bureau, the police, or of obtaining legal help from the outside courts, for these institutions actually contribute to the situation. Groups of forced job placement prisoners often continue to work in the same labor camp, or if the number of those having completed their sentences was small, they might then be transferred to another labor camp where they would be joined by other prisoners with the same designation. Though told that they were now free, they were not allowed to leave. They were forced to continue working according to the labor camp's production schedules and were constantly pressed to prove that they had reformed their counter-revolutionary thought processes. Some prisoners were kept in detention so that they would not influence those on the outside by either their nationalism or in recounting the extent of the sufferings of the detained." End quote. Adhe was transferred to a flour mill located on the same road as the prisons. The conditions in the mill were an improvement from the conditions in the labor camps. The prisoners earned money, which they then used to buy food coupons and necessities. Adhe was not allowed out of the camp to the town to buy necessities, so two of the men offered to buy them for her. She also ate as much sampa as she needed during the day when she was working, so she often gave her food coupons to the other workers who were more in need of food. However, Adhe was labeled a, quote, black hat, a designation that meant she was the most dangerous type of prisoner because she was not indoctrinated and continued to resist the Chinese. Quote, "It seemed that there would be no end to my imprisonment, yet I took some solace in the fact that conditions had markedly improved over the years. I missed the company of my friends and the confidences that we shared, yet I had met a member of my own family in prison. Through all those years, I had learned to live within myself and to keep silent if necessary. I could only continue to pray and see what each coming day would bring." End quote. Adhe was then moved from the mill back to other work, including cutting trees. She had to cut the trees, load them into the cart as she worked going up the hill. She then had to take the load back down the hill and deliver her quota to the guards at the end of each day. The other prisoners helped her, and she became notorious in the prison and the local area. Her story began to be passed prisoner to prisoner, Tibetan to Tibetan. It's incredible that she was able to find some good in her new situation at the flour mill, and she's, whether the conditions were slightly improved, but it didn't stop her even after 12 years of imprisonment at this point, that it showed that she valued kindness and generosity, and she was giving away her food coupons to other workers. It's incredible.
Yeah, and in reading her accounting of this, it almost seemed like she was resigned to the fact that she wasn't actually going to be released. One can only think about, she knew how long her prison sentence was, and as she's getting closer and closer to the release date, only to be told, basically, we never are going to release you unless we want to, because we don't consider you indoctrinated. And so all this effort that she had gone through to not be indoctrinated, to stand strong, the communists used it against her and continued to make her give them forced labor.
I did think it was interesting, though, that that woman, one of the Chinese head of the camp, almost it felt like she was telling herself that no, Adi is the one that suffered. We have not suffered. It's such a they clearly were threatened. They kept labeling her as this highest level of threat, and they really knew that she was steadfast, that she was not going to break. And I just think it's incredible that one person could really impact almost a whole movement in a way.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, she was threatening to them because their entire system revolved around oppression. So if you can't oppress somebody, and they're not allowing you to control them, no matter what you do to them, that would be the absolute most dangerous person for the regime. And so very clearly, that was Adi, in a lot of the camps that she was at. And, I did wonder why they allowed her to live. And I don't mean that in any sort of a crass way, but given all of the trouble that she was for the guards, and I don't mean intentional trouble, I mean, philosophical and psychological trouble for them versus the other women that were there. I just, it makes me wonder just about that situation.
Ringchen Samdup arrived at the labor camp on February 15, 1974. His sentence was complete on February 5th, but he was told that his release would cause a disturbance in the society, and thus it was best for him to remain in detention. He and Adi would become close, often meeting at night after work to talk. In January 1976, the Prime Minister of China died. A month later, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army died. And on September 9th, Mao Zedong died. The 40-year-old concentration of power was broken, but Adi continued to be imprisoned. As the attitude at the labor camp began to change as a result of the power shift, the new Chinese leader removed the black hat designation from the prisoners. Quote, "They told us, the people who subjected you to black hat were the Gang of Four. From today, you are not snake spirits or devils, but you are real human beings. From now on, you can wear proper clean clothes, you can raise your heads, and you can have freedom of movement. You will no longer be subjected to the Thangxing." End quote. With the removal of the black hat designation, Adi was given a 15-day pass to go home, with her relative and Ringchen kept at the camp to assure her return. She was given documents and told to register with the police when she arrived. It was the first time in 21 years she had been home. She was also warned not to discuss anything about her imprisonment when she was at home. What she found was complete devastation. The majority of her family had been executed, imprisoned, or had died. Her son went insane when she was taken away and killed himself by jumping into the river. Her daughter, who was an infant when she was arrested, was living now with a family member. In their awkward meetings, it was clear to Adi that she had another mother now, and that Adi was on the outside looking in. The visit did nothing to free Adi's spirit. At the end of the visit, she decided she would not return again. There was nothing left for her there. Quote, "All the pain, separation, and loss of those 21 years seemed to well up in my heart. It had been unbearable, and now there was nothing." End quote. So after over 20 years of imprisonment, she had to have been looking forward to coming home, but probably nervous, not sure what she would found, and I'm sure her worst fears were realized in finding just kind of her family is obliterated and her what's left doesn't even know her.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's this weird dichotomy of the rest of the world continuing to turn while your entire world is completely frozen in time when you're in these labor camps. And like you said, it was really her worst nightmare. I'm sure that at night, when she was alone, she was dreaming of her daughter and her reuniting and her son and them being together again as a family. And I'm sure that thoughts of her family kept her going in a lot of the darkest moments when she was imprisoned. So coming home to find that sort of almost fairy tale that she had made in her mind, that was really her rock to get her through, was just not there.
Adi returned to the camp. Later that year, her relative and most of the other prisoners were released. She was detained for another 5 years. She was finally released due to the efforts of her brother, Jughoma, who had escaped to Kathmandu, Nepal from Tibet in 1959 as part of the Dalai Lama's guards, who had managed to smuggle the Dalai Lama out of Tibet before he was imprisoned. He wrote to the highest authorities in Tsartseto asking why she had still been detained. He said that if Adhe were released, he would come to Tibet to meet her. It worked. Adhe was released. Before her release, a top official at the camp warned her, quote, "You must be very careful not to reveal anything to the public about your experiences and the Chinese methods of re-education through labor. If you should decide to say anything about the starvation of prisoners or what happened to your relatives, it will be regarded as a crime." He continued, if you do speak of these things and we find out, you will once again be detained, end quote. Adhe was released with Rinchen one winter day just after the Tibetan New Year in 1985. So it seemed like all they had left, the Chinese, were to threaten her at this point. And I mean, I wonder if she was even fazed by that.
I mean, it was this blatant threat that, in essence, telling her everything you experienced has been hidden from everybody else. And we haven't told the world about this, and no one knows about this. And don't you dare tell anybody that this even existed. And I can only imagine for Adhe, who had just been through so many torturous years, probably to her, this was almost a joke. What else could you threaten her with? They threatened to re-imprison her, but she'd already been imprisoned for so long. And I don't think at that point, this really weighed on her mind. I mean, I think it was just kind of this veiled, attempt to make her not talk, because they absolutely did not want word getting out to anybody that this had happened. I mean, there could be a huge uprising. Again, now we're getting into 1985. The world stage is starting to grow. People are able to communicate better in and out of Tibet. And so you have this sort of abject fear by the Chinese that, word's going to get out, and now the world's going to come knocking. Adhe returned to her family after her release. The Tibetans had been allowed to start rebuilding the monasteries in 1983, but they were a hollow shell compared to the priceless artifacts that they had once contained. Quote, "Due to the strong propaganda against me, there was hardly anyone in my region who hadn't heard of me. Even the children quietly came around and said, 'That's Adhe. That is the lady.' Everyone was very supportive and did whatever they could to help me. I told my friends and relatives, quote, 'I have now spent 27 years in someone else's land, and only in 1985 am I able to return to my own native land and to be with my daughter.'" End quote. One day, a letter came from Jughoma telling Adhe that she should come to Kathmandu, making a pilgrimage to Lhasa and various religious sites in Nepal on the way. And then they would return to Tibet together. This, however, was not the truth. He was never returning to Tibet. The letter was for the benefit of the police, so that when Adhe showed it to them, they would allow her to travel to Kathmandu to bring her brother home. With a travel pass in hand, Adhe and Rinchen made their way to Lhasa and then on to Kathmandu. Quote, "The entire trip from Lhasa had taken 5 days. Suddenly, we were free. We had left Tibet for the first time and possibly the last. Upon our arrival, we felt a sense of rising emotion and were a bit stunned. We could only force ourselves to look ahead to the many possibilities we would now encounter, to think of an iron door closing behind us that would have been unbearable. After another 10 hours of travel, we reached my brother's home in Kathmandu." End quote. When Adhe saw her brother for the first time in 33 years, she was overjoyed. She wanted to travel to India to meet the exiled spiritual and political leader of Tibet, the Dalai Lama. Her brother, however, had aged and was in no condition to travel on. Ensuring he had adequate care, Adhe and Rinchen continued on to India. So this quote that I read about, Adhe leaving Tibet, it just reinforces that, even though she was technically free inside of Tibet, she wasn't. She had to register with the police. Her movements were watched. What she said to people were watched. And so when she finally is able to get out, it must have been just this oxygen just released to her, and this ability to breathe again after so many years.
Well, and having fought for so long against that, it's kind of it was really neat to see how they kind of had to find this creative way amongst this, culture of rigid conformity, to kind of use the Chinese own policies against them. And it's kind of like one last way to stick it to them that, hey, you don't rule us, we rule ourselves.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking that is she was basically concocting this completely fake story with her brother in order to, con the police. And I was thinking, she's got how many years of experience doing that? This is kind of like her little step of revenge in a way, right? I mean, she's on the way out the door. She's basically saying, you never got my mind. And now I'm going to use it once again to be stronger than you are. Adhe and Rinchen made their way over the Nepalese-Indian border and to Dharamsala, where the exiled Dalai Lama and many exiled Tibetans were living. They were taken to a guest house to rest and were promised that the Dalai Lama would be notified of their arrival. After a few days, they were taken for an audience with the Dalai Lama. Meeting the Dalai Lama was the peak of any Tibetan spiritual experience. For Adhe, who had suffered for decades, it was a confirmation that her enduring strength and faith had, at last, seen her to freedom. The Dalai Lama encouraged Adhe to write a book about her life. Quote, His Holiness took my hand and told me, "You have suffered so much. You should now record your experiences in a book for the sake of the dead and for the living." His eyes were filled with compassion, and his presence filled my heart with the realization that our journey had not been in vain. Silence enveloped the room as His Holiness lowered his head in prayer. When we left, we felt deeply fulfilled. End quote. During later audiences, the Dalai Lama inquired about whether she had started writing her story and, even if she could not write, that she should start by using a tape recorder. So, I mean, I know a lot of people in modern society have heard of the Dalai Lama, but he really was the head, sort of exiled leader of Tibet and this spiritual just presence for them. And the honor that Adhe must have felt after so many years of just getting to meet him. And then here he is interested in her story and what she's gone through. And so that must have just been so empowering for her.
I was thinking the very same thing, and it must have just, kind of relaxed and softened her maybe, because I was thinking about it, he's kind of, it wouldn't have come across this way, but he's saying you should write your story, and it didn't come from a place of control like all the last 20 years of commands essentially that she's been receiving, but it came from a place of compassion. And it really is an amazing image just to think of her maybe finally getting a little bit of a place of rest and support.
Yeah, and the other thing that I was left sort of thinking was this: Adhe was never really planning on telling her story. And so without the Dalai Lama's urging, this story that we've been telling today would never have been told.
So Adhe started to give her living testimony to the world through interviews and this book. Quote, "There was no choice but for me to make this journey. Somehow I have survived, a witness to the voices of my dying compatriots, my family and friends. Those I once knew are gone, and I have given them my solemn promise that somehow their lives will not be wiped out, forgotten, and confused within a web of history that has been rewritten by those who find it useful to destroy the memory of many I have known and loved. Fulfilling this promise is the only purpose remaining in my life." End quote. So really, this book is kind of her legacy and her way of making sure that those lives are remembered forever.
Yeah, and the incredible burden that she must felt to tell this living testimony. And the book goes into a little bit of depth about, she did some traveling around the world, particularly Germany, to sit on panels and to, give this testimony in all kinds of different forums. But, for her, while it must have been gratifying to be able to finally talk about it, that burden of having to carry all of those stories, of telling the story, not just your own, but all of the people that you had encountered in the labor camps and in prison, and remembering them and what they went through, and also remembering the people in Tibet who are still there. Life in Tibet remains unstable. The U.S. has reiterated its policy that it believes there is but one China, and that Tibet is part of China. The Dalai Lama, in an audience with former President Obama, told the president that his wish was not for Tibetan independence, but for Tibetan autonomy. Since March 2008, at least 600 Tibetans have been detained by the Chinese for political reasons. And on that note, that's all we have for today. Thanks for listening to Adhe's story and for sharing this experience with us. You can interact with us and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we announce episodes and share additional information about each podcast. If you have questions or comments about today's podcast, please submit them to us via our website at modernathenas.com, our Facebook page under Modern Athenas, our Twitter account at Modern Athenas, or our Instagram at the Modern Athenas Podcast. We would also appreciate it if you support our podcast by leaving us a review on iTunes or Stitcher and subscribing to the podcast. In our next podcast, we will be discussing the book Special Agent: My Life on the Front Lines as a Woman in the FBI by Candace DeLong. As we leave you today, we want to remind you to never forget that each of you, like the Modern Athenas we have discussed throughout our podcasts, and Adhe today, has the power and capacity to be a changemaker in your world. Work hard, dream big, and reach for the stars.